Hi, welcome to QuickTake series on COVID-19 and the future of, where we'll be taking a deeper dive into how this novel coronavirus is impacting our lives right now and in the future. Thank you all for joining me today. Let's get straight to it. So whether you're a parent worried about whether it's safe to send your children back to school, or maybe you're in college and you're thinking about what's going to happen with your exams, or whether you'll even be able to go back to live on campus, everyone has the same question. Is it safe to reopen schools, and how do you even do that in a COVID-19 world? Let's have a look.
Over 1 billion children out of school, children and youth. School closures in over 180 countries around the world, nationwide. At this point, it's affecting virtually the entire world.
Millions of parents across the country are struggling as they try to homeschool their children.
The governor's order to close schools takes effect for everyone.
Very unlikely schools would resume this school year.
School is more than a building. It's part of the social fabric of our lives, of children's lives. Everybody is having a major change, but they're living this experience very differently. And I think that's something we really need to keep in mind when we're thinking about solutions as well, to recognize the diversity of experience.
So where I am right now in the UK, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, recently unveiled plans to reopen schools in England from June 1st. And this follows in the footsteps of other European countries like Denmark and Germany, for example. But there's been lots of conversation about how big a role children play in spreading the virus. And we've seen lots of conflicting advice from scientists. Some scientists say that it's actually children are less likely to spread the virus, whereas other scientists are saying that children are just as contagious as adults. So, Nathalie, what do we know? What does the current science and data tell us about the role that children play in spreading COVID-19?
Well, I think the answer to that is that we still don't know, and it's still not entirely clear. We know that with other respiratory viruses, children often carry quite high viral loads and are quite effective at shedding those viruses. But when it comes to COVID-19, I think the jury is still out really in terms of their ability to spread the virus. While we know that children are not as severely affected as adults are by this virus, what we have seen is that if you look at the numbers or the proportion of people testing positive within any age group for the actual virus at the back of the throat, the data from the UK is that so far that is fairly consistent across all age groups. It's just that children may not have as many symptoms. So I think it's unclear. When it comes to antibody levels, we're seeing that actually they seem to be a little bit lower in some of the younger age children than in adults. But that, again, may not necessarily correlate with how infectious a child could be. So I think the answer is we don't know. And so therefore, we need to take appropriate precautions. Certainly, a child could be just as infectious as an adult if they are carrying the virus at the back of their throat. So I don't think we should assume that children wouldn't be infectious if they were carrying the virus.
Thank you, Nathalie. So let's have a look. We've got a question from one of our followers. This one is from @KevinPengInsta on Instagram. He says, there's always a discussion about social distancing, but can schools enforce it? And I think that's a really interesting question because we've seen multiple reports from parents and carers and even teachers' unions talking about whether it's even possible to enforce social distancing in schools. So, Susannah, I'm going to put this question to you. Is it possible to enforce social distancing in schools, especially with young kids who like touching each other and touching their faces and enjoying life?
Yes, it's a really good question, and one that's obviously high on the minds of teachers and school leaders and obviously parents. And I'm one of those parents. I'm thinking about whether or not to send my own baby back to nursery in a couple of weeks' time. This epidemic is obviously very unusual, so we don't have very much in terms of evidence from the past to draw on that can tell us, is it possible to implement social distancing in schools and classrooms? Of course, in richer countries like here in the UK and the US, there are some measures that should be very possible to implement. For example, regular hand washing with soap. That's a lot more difficult in poorer countries, though. Less than a quarter of schools in sub-Saharan Africa have basic hygiene and hand washing facilities, so even that's going to be quite challenging there. But what we do know in terms of social distancing itself is that we know it's going to be really hard. We need to be led by the science, but at the same time, we have to remember that social distancing, i.e. keeping 2 meters apart, as we've been told, isn't really binary. It's sort of a spectrum. I've never run a school myself, so I'm not going to say that it's going to be easy for leaders and teachers to do it. But I do think it should be possible to reduce risks by implementing elements of social distancing, even if we can't adhere to every child being 2 meters apart from every other child all the time. I think sort of the second thing I'd say, and I sort of completely defer to Nathalie on the science here, is that we probably can't expect robust social distancing, particularly among very young children. But since we haven't seen any outbreaks in the schools and nurseries that were kept open for key workers, for children of key workers, and very few outbreaks in schools and nurseries globally, I think we can at least be somewhat reassured that children are very unlikely themselves to become sick. So actually managing the adult-to-adult transmission seems to be important here. And it's certainly very possible to keep adults away from adults. I think finally, we sort of need to be sure that schools reopening and sort of social distancing is accompanied by rigorous testing and tracing and isolation. And I'm sure teachers for sure want to be assured that this will be in place before schools do open.
And going off your point, thank you, Susannah. Janet, we've seen lots of conversations about universities, like Harvard, for example, was the first to close its campus, one of the first. Can you talk about social distancing in higher education? What's going on in that industry?
So colleges recognized very early on that students live in very close proximity in dorms. They share bathrooms, they share kitchens, they go to parties, they're in very close proximity. So they made the decision early on that they could not help, they couldn't support having students on campus, and they sent them home, which was very big news, and it was very surprising for a lot of students to have to leave so quickly, and of course go to online learning. Now, many schools have canceled their summer programs where students could take classes on campus. High school students also come on campus and do pre-college programs. And colleges have had to do this at great cost because it was typically something where they could earn extra money to keep the dorms open. So those decisions were not made lightly at all. Now, the question is, what's going to happen in the fall? And a couple of schools have said, we're not opening. We're going to say now we're going to be online. The California state system said that last week. Over in the UK, Cambridge has said that yesterday. However, some schools here have said they're going to plan to be open in the fall. Notre Dame in Indiana said yesterday that they were planning to open 2 weeks early in August. They would not have a fall break, and they would leave before Thanksgiving in November. So it's still quite early. I think colleges are trying to figure out the best thing to do, what is safe, but there are also huge economic pressures if they don't open in the fall because they get a huge amount of revenue from room and board. And if classes are online, students are not going to want to pay the full price tag to take classes, in their parents' houses, and they're paying for that in-person experience, that one-on-one learning experience with professors and meeting a social network. And we've already seen lawsuits against colleges for this past semester that they're not getting what they paid for.
Thank you, Janet. Let's have a look at another question we have on Twitter this time. At Barhoot1 says, why not keep the learning from a distance method? Kids are the future, we need to keep them safe. So this goes, from your point, Janet, about virtual learning. But I'm going to put this question to Nathalie. I think that, this pandemic has shown a lot of people that, schools are not just learning places, they're also a very important part of the fabric of our society, especially for vulnerable children and people in disadvantaged societies. So could you talk about the impact of school settings and the importance of school settings?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to realise that a school setting is a social environment as well as a learning environment. And, we need to be careful when we think about children's mental health as well, and them being separated from interacting with their peers and their friends and having that environment to go to each day. But I think that's of particular importance for children who come from, homes that are maybe not as stable as others, homes where there might be domestic violence or very maybe stringent methods of trying to control children's behaviour. And I think also we need to bear in mind that there are many families in the UK in particular who rely on free school meals for their children to ensure that they get adequate nutrition each day, because they simply can't afford to provide them with sufficient nutritional meals throughout the day, every day. And while there are some voluntary groups who have taken it upon themselves to try and provide such children with meals each lunchtime, I think we need to bear in mind that there will be some children who have been missed out there. And so we need to think about the aspects on children's nutrition from those groups, the home stability and the vulnerable environment that some children may find themselves in at the home, and they don't get a break from that by going to school. And also a lot of the monitoring of those home environments takes place by teachers and head teachers at schools who see if children are suffering and are able to flag that to social services. A lot of that is being missed as well. And then also the impact on children's mental health in terms of them not having the opportunity to interact with their peers and play with their friends, and also what they gain in terms of satisfaction in life from being in a learning environment and the interaction with their teachers.
Thank you, Nathalie. And Susannah, you've actually written a lot about how previous disease outbreaks, which have led to extended school closures for long periods of time. Can you talk about that? What happened during the Ebola crisis, for example?
Yeah, sure. So I would concur with all of the sort of adverse effects of school closures that Nathalie described. And we know a little bit about what happened in previous school closures, as you say, for example, during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, where a study by Oriana Bandiera et al. Found that there was sort of a significant spike in teenage pregnancies as a result of school closures, and that young girls were less likely to return to school subsequently. We also know quite a bit about what happens to learning while schools are closed. So we can do that by looking at whether or not children retain learning during their long summer holidays. And what we can see from data in the US and the UK and elsewhere is that, children do lose learning, and learning loss is most likely to disadvantage poorer children. And I think we can sort of see that learning issue being really front and central in the minds of teachers here in the UK and elsewhere at the moment, where even here there's, I think, twice as many children in private schools are accessing online learning on a daily basis to children who are not in private schools. In low-income countries, only about 10% of children even have access to the internet. So you can really see that richer children are probably able to continue learning, but poorer children are really disadvantaged in that respect.
Thank you, Susannah. And Janet, you've written about the economics of it and the impact of, children taking gap years, for example. Can you talk about that piece and how students taking gap years might actually widen the socio-economic inequality in society?
Sure. No, I have a story in this week's Bloomberg Business Week that looks at the socioeconomics of gap years. And that's traditionally been the year when students have delayed college for 1 year. They can do a travel program, they can work, they can do any number of things to try to make themselves a little more mature before they go to college, take a break from the burnout. And you're seeing that typically lower income students, very high achieving low income students who are going to these top schools like MIT and Harvard and Amherst College, they are going. They're not deterred by online learning because they see this as a way to get out of poverty and to better their economic situation for themselves and their families. So they're looking at the long-term approach, and they're not concerned about delaying. Where you see wealthier families may be more inclined to ask for a gap year because they don't want to pay the full price tag, in some cases $70,000, to take classes at home. In colleges, they don't know if they're going to be offering in-person classes. Nobody knows yet. So it'll be interesting to see when college makes their firm announcements, probably closer to July and August, about online classes, how many students are asking to defer. And that creates other problems in addition to college budgets. If a lot of students say we don't want to come back next year, colleges rely on income to make their budgets and frankly, to survive. And if you're starting to see more students say we're not coming, that will have a big impact. And if more students defer for their freshman year in the fall, that also has an impact on the current high school juniors, because you don't want to see a lot of spots taken up for that year. So it has a cascading effect.
You also wrote a story about the impact of college towns. So when universities shut their doors, what happens to the businesses around it, and what are universities doing to help?
So if you think of a small college town, they're completely dependent on students. And as I wrote a few months ago, it's not just students having coffee or pizza, it's their parents visiting. It's also high school students coming to look at colleges and spending time there. It's conferences, academic conferences that colleges host. It's sports teams. And also these colleges are often employers. So it has a big impact if all of a sudden a large group of consumers are missing. We've written stories about the the PPP program, Paycheck Protection Program. And some colleges were not able to get those loans because there was some confusion about how student workers should be counted. Are they part-time employees, is what colleges had asked for. So that potentially is the money that some schools may have missed out on. So there's a lot of issues here, economic issues that that aren't just about the students who attend the schools.
Thank you, Janet. Let's have a look at another question from one of our followers. This time on Instagram, we've got @Galaxy_Rose14, who says, how have schools changed due to the pandemic? So I think this is quite a big question. Susannah, I'm going to put it to you. What should students expect when they go back to school?
Well, I guess it's important to recognise that at the moment, schools are still schools. So here in the UK, they're still educating quite a number of children, children of key workers and vulnerable children. And they're also educating many, many, many more children through their distance learning programs. So schools are open and teachers are doing a really heroic job to try to keep kids learning and to try to keep kids safe despite the pandemic. And I've seen a lot written about sort of what is the future of education post-coronavirus. I think if you look at, let's take EdTech as one example there, I think a lot of people have seen this pandemic as potentially, the day where EdTech, education technology, finally sort of makes its mark and has its day. And I guess I'm sort of slightly skeptical that that's actually the case right now. We still see that a great many children aren't able to access proper education technology. And those who are, including children of my own friends, are not really enjoying it, and they're kind of desperate to get back into the classroom. So I do hope that we'll have learned a lot, particularly about how to look after disadvantaged children and vulnerable children. Are we going to see a sort of radical revolution in schooling post-pandemic? I'm not so sure.
And Nathalie, what do you think, going off of what Susannah said? Are you feeling optimistic? Have we learned more about how schools should be when they reopen?
I'm going to be honest. I think that the time will tell. Really, I think we've learned a lot about the importance of social distancing, but we've also learned a lot about the importance of having interaction with people. And I think for a society that was moving increasingly towards being very technology heavy and dependent, we've actually realized just how important that social interaction is for our mental health, and also just how much of a natural human process that is, that can't simply be replaced by technology. So I think certainly the pandemic will have had an impact on the way we move forward with certain things in schools and in businesses, and how we use technology. But I think it's also highlighted the importance to us of having that daily social interaction. But how we can do that in a way that is safe and permits a degree of social distancing, I think time will tell, and we're still learning about how to do that in the best ways.
Thank you. And Janet, we've seen that, you know, the higher education industry is a huge industry and it's been forced online because of COVID-19. So we've seen big changes already. Do you think that maybe online courses will be more prominent in universities in the future?
Well, I think professors have largely resisted doing online courses. And certainly if you're paying a high price tag to go to college, you're going for that one-on-one human interaction. But I do think that you'll find some efficiencies that, you know, professors can send lectures ahead of time, and their time spent in class is more on a discussion. So I do think you will see some changes, certainly. And the question is, if you're continuing to be online for a while, how does that impact the price? Because that is a big factor in colleges, is, again, how much parents are paying and what are they actually getting for what they're paying. And the price tag for some colleges could be quite high, $75,000 a year.
So do you think that school fees will decrease, perhaps?
Well, if there's going to be only online classes in the fall, you know, students will not be expected to pay for room and board. You know, as we've seen, there have been refunds, and colleges have talked about the room and board refunds, you know, as being a contributor to their economic issues. But we'll see. You know, there are some class action lawsuits out there with students saying, we're not getting what we paid for, you should refund some of our tuition. So it'll be a question a lot of people are watching.
And, you know, international students, they play such an important role in the ecosystem of higher education. But with travel bans and people feeling anxious about traveling, how are colleges going to handle the international student situation?
It's a very good question. Many colleges have become dependent on the fees that international students pay. So we already know that, you know, wealthier students may not want to come next year. International students may not be able to. That's a huge hole in their budgets. In fact, in the story on gap years, we referenced a survey, and 30% of the international students said they were considering, you know, deferring their enrollment. So if they can't get there, then they may have to make a choice. Are they willing to, again, pay these steep prices for online learning and at some point come back, or forego coming, which would have a disastrous impact in college bottom line.
Thank you, Janet. Now, it's obvious that, you know, global leaders and politicians have to make really tough decisions about whether to reopen schools, but I'm going to put it all to our guests today. Do you think schools should reopen, yes or no? And if not, in one sentence only, when should they reopen? So we'll go with Nathalie first.
So I think it's balancing up the importance of parents being able to go back to work as well, and which children it is absolutely essential for them to return to school. I think we are in such close proximity to the school summer holidays anyway, that actually, given where the R0, so the reproduction number is in the UK at the moment, I would prefer to hold off opening schools until the next academic year, starting in September. That will give us more time to get the reproduction number well below 1, not just below 1, which will result in less of a resurgence of cases and interaction through interaction of people and the public generally.
Okay, so in summary, that's no, but maybe later on when the R number goes down, is that correct?
Yes, but obviously by that point we will be in the school summer holidays anyway. So I think the next academic year is a good opportunity. But bearing in mind that people do need to return to work as well, and it's very difficult to do that if your children are at home.
Thank you. And Susannah, is it time to reopen schools?
That's the $64 million question. I think sort of first of all, it really varies from country to country, of course. And, looking back at the data from some of the European countries that have opened their schools, so sort of France, Germany, Denmark, and others, they all had quite a lot fewer daily reported cases than we currently have in the UK at the moment. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. But we do have to weigh up the science and the infection rates with the social consequences of schools being closed. And some of those consequences really are quite catastrophic for children. And the thought of them being out of school for 6 months is very difficult, particularly for disadvantaged and vulnerable children. So I would really like to see schools go back before the summer if they can. If we see by the end of May that cases are dropping and more on the par with what we're seeing in France and Germany, then I think that sort of probably makes sense in the UK to start taking those cautious steps. But I think they have to be very cautious steps as we prepare to lock down again if we think that numbers are rising again.
Thank you, Susannah. Same question to you, Janet. Is it time to reopen schools and colleges?
Well, I think Nathalie made a good point with the summer holidays. Colleges are wrapping up their terms now. They've all decided any courses for the summer will be online. So they do have some time to make decisions. And as we've seen from some schools that say they're planning and they're hoping to be open in the fall, it's in combination with permission from health agencies, but also there has to be testing, there has to be tracing, there has to be masks, they have to rethink dorms. So, I think safety will be balanced within those decisions, which, there's safety and there's the economics of not opening. And, I think safety is going to have to be first and foremost.
Thank you, Janet. So this is the end of the discussion. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's given me a lot to think about. See you next time for another discussion on COVID-19 and the future of.